Welcome to Cutting Edge Catholics, a podcast of renewal, reconstruction, and resistance by voices within the independent Catholic movement. For more information on inclusive Catholicism, please visit extraordinarycatholics.faith. And now, meet your hosts, Reverend Dr. Trish Sullivan-Bonney and Reverend Dr. Jayme Matthias.
Welcome to Cutting Edge Catholics, a podcast of renewal, reconstruction, and resistance. I'm Father Jayme Matthias.
And I am Reverend Trish Sullivan-Bonney.
We are excited to be with you today because as we read in the news various headlines of U.S. military involvement in Venezuela and now possible action in Mexico, it draws our eyes to our friends south of the U.S. border. And today we have a very special guest in our movement who knows something about the Southern Hemisphere. Reverend Trish, tell us all about our guest.
Well, I am super excited to introduce to all of you, our listeners and watchers, the guy I like to call my bish. Not that I don't take him quite seriously, but I like a little nickname because Irish people like to show their love that way. So with us today is Bishop Paul Burson. To all of us, he is Pablo. He is an amazing, prayerful, kind, and clear leader in my jurisdiction, my little mic. For those of you who don't know that word yet, that's our little micro denominations in the movement that we're part of, the Ecumenical Catholic Communion. And so, Pablo, I'm super excited that you could join us for all the reasons Jayme mentioned, and also because I'm just so critically aware of what we are doing to the migrants here in this country. Last night, my spouse Pete and I were watching the news, watching the people in Charlotte, North Carolina, mobilize, gathering in churches to try to figure out what they're going to do in response to ICE. So we want to talk to you about your experience with those beautiful communities that you've been part of. You also are someone who's a student of liberation theology and who shepherds young people as they go on mission from a Jesuit university. We'd love to hear about that. So we're going to just kind of be, as I like to say, in the dance of conversation with you to hear what you think about the current state of affairs. And of course, we as independent Catholics, Jayme and I like to think of ourselves that we call ourselves cutting edge in this podcast. I like to say we're the edgy Catholics. What's our response? What grounds us and what calls us to be in action? I think the first place to start always is to have you introduce yourself and just tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do, and we'll just kick it off from there. So, Pablo.
Thank you very much for having me on your podcast. I'm excited to be with you to share with you a little bit about my own background, but also what I've learned over the years through living in Latin America, living in Guatemala, visiting El Salvador many times with students from the Jesuit University where I work, and how I've seen things happening in this country that unfortunately remind me of the way the U.S. has supported other countries, let's say anti-terrorist, if you will, anti-communist, anti-institution, anti-government, what's been done in other countries, and how seeing what's happening here reminds me of the injustices there. So it's real good to be here. Maybe I could start by sharing a little bit. I'm presiding bishop for the Ecumenical Catholic Communion, and I have the privilege to be able to be with so many communities in the United States that are seeking to live an inclusive Catholicism, something that with a deep faith life and a deep spiritual life, and what I'm inspired always by our communities is they have a sense of really reaching out to those who are on the margins. So it's a privilege to walk with people in that way. And so many years ago, when I wanted to be a priest, I always wanted to be a missionary priest, and I was originally heading towards Burundi, and unfortunately, the church and the state had so many problems that they eventually told me, how about going to Latin America instead? And I was like, they don't speak French there, and that's what I was learning. And so I went ahead and went to Mexico and kind of fell in love with the people in Mexico, fell in love with the language, and that prepared me to eventually go to Latin America. And I was really fortunate to be in formation after ordination with a Maryknoll program that really looked to change the way that priests and sisters were in maybe ministry. Old models would be like, Father knows best, and Sister has all the answers, and will come into communities, and people will open up their mouths and open up their lives, and we will fill them what we know is best for them. And fortunately, the whole methodology and the way of being in the world through the Maryknolls was accompaniment. It's like you're going there to be with people and see what they need and walk with them. So I was very fortunate to have that as my way of introduction to how to be with people. So when I was working in Guatemala, I was visiting. Initially, I was pastor of two parishes, and then there were maybe 13 other mission parishes that were connected to those two. And then eventually, as time went on, our mission team was visiting maybe up to 50 parishes, mission parishes. So lots of traveling around the Petén area of Guatemala, and people were fleeing other parts of the country due to war, and they were moving to the jungle areas that were usually inaccessible, but lumber trucks came in, and roads were made, and eventually people found their way to kind of through slash and burn methods of farming to try to eke out a living on corn and beans in the middle of the jungle, but usually escaping from areas of the country that were in conflict. Genocide was taking place in a number of areas against the Mayan people.
And Pablo, can you give us a sense of the time frame of that for those
Sure,
listeners who are less familiar with that history?
right. I was there from 1987 to like 1992 or so, um, and back and forth to the States a couple years. And during that time in Guatemala, there had been a war that began way back in the 50s, and it lasted for over 30 years. So, and while that was going on, the war that was about 15 years in El Salvador they were in the middle of that war. So, lots of U.S. Sponsored, paid for $1 million a day budgets that were going into those countries to keep them safe from turning into communist countries. That's the way it was seen at the time during the Cold War. So hopefully that's helpful to give you a sense of what was going on. And our work with folks was a lot of sacramental circuit riding on horses and on boats and using jeeps and going walking into places that are really tough to access in other ways, and trying to help people continue their faith lives and hear what was going on with them in the middle of difficult living and middle of a war-torn country.
Bishop Pablo, what strikes me is that you were there in Latin America during some very dark times. I'm reminded of this Saturday, we celebrated International Day for Tolerance. And on Substack, I wrote an article on our friend Ignacio Ellacuría,
Hmm.
Latin American liberation theologian who was murdered along with 5 other Jesuits and 2 women in 1989. The
Hmm.
military there considered them subversives. I'm thinking of the memories of El Salvador come to mind with the great Archbishop there, Oscar Arnulfo Romero y Galdames, who was murdered there in 1980. Tell us how some of these events impacted your experience and the experience of the people there. I'm just imagining, in liberation theology, we talk about how it is that the cries of the oppressed are bound up in the cross, and which is a very rich symbol in Latin America. Tell us about how these events really impacted you and those you served.
Sure. Probably it's good to share with you a little bit about how a lot of us came into understanding liberation theology. Uh, there was a sense, and I work with students right now at the university, and we go on a pilgrimage every year to Guatemala and El Salvador and visit the places of where the Jesuit martyrs and their housekeeper and daughter were murdered. We visit the sites where Oscar Romero was killed, and we meet many other people who either met them or had were deeply affected by their lives. And so I think what happened to many of us is coming down and seeing people living in really tough poverty. And I remember being in a church one time, and it was a corrugated metal roof and sides, and it was hot. It was really, really hot. And I was talking to people about how, what's the path they saw to heaven, right? And the path that they understood was if they suffered well and suffered patiently, that would enable them to enter into heaven after they died. So that sort of thinking sort of was something that a lot of people had in different places, right? And and it was sort of promoted, right? It's a very convenient theology to have and to promote if those who are taking the lion's share of goods and wealth and they're encouraging that piece of that isolated piece of scriptures to be, you know, to be taught and to flourish. It's all about charity, right? All about charity and being submissive and so I think what happened to people is they began to have a sense of, does God want us to be living this way? Are we supposed to be in misery? And and unfortunately, for many, many years, if you will, centuries, there was a sense of like, that's your lot in life and just accept it. That's how it is for you, right? And fortunately, little by little, there's been an awakening of people asking the question, is this the way God really wants us to live? Does God want people to be living in misery and people dying of starvation? And eventually, people in Latin America, through Latin, teachings and coming around to understanding the realities of the world and their own experience, that um, I don't think God wants this, right? And that came through people learning how to read and reading the Bible and beginning reflecting on the Bible. And you might have heard of this expression of comunidades de base. And so, to back track a little bit, and after the bishops from Latin America went to the Second Vatican Council, they found that it didn't really address their needs. So they eventually had their own meetings in what was called Medellin and the city in Colombia. And they eventually came from that came documents and the sense of God having a preferential option for the poor. And what did that mean, right? What did that mean? And so as they began to ask the questions about what this meant, they began to examine people's realities and moving beyond just individual sin to looking at corporate sin, if you will, institutionalized violence and sin. What does that look like? Slavery, for instance. Um, anyways, as people began to reflect, learn how to read, and began to reflect together, they identified with passages in the Bible like Moses and how people were in slavery and they were called out of that slavery and they saw that slavery wasn't a good thing. So they identified with these things that were taking place many years ago in the biblical stories, and they began to see their lives as such that they need to stand up for their rights, stand up for what God really wanted for them and their children, which was not just liberation from personal sin.
It's very striking to me hearing you say that, Pablo. We know that for our African American Christian brothers and sisters, the story of the liberation from slavery in Egypt is a just seminal narrative in their identity. And it really drives home to me the beauty that of the Christian community retaining the canon that precedes Jesus, that those stories are that Jesus illuminates so much for us about what the potential of those stories for us. I also am really struck listening to you. I remember when I was doing my PhD reading a book called Vatican II, A Sociological Analysis by Melissa Wilde. And what was very interesting about that book is she wasn't a theologian. She just looked at the composition of the council and how the votes went and what the dynamics were, that finally at that gathering, there was actually a really diverse representation of bishops from around the globe. Prior to that, in Vatican I and then Trent, you think of how few councils there were in that 500-year window. They were almost all European bishops. For Vatican I, it was the novelty of having American bishops and some African bishops. However, they were overwhelmingly Irish nationals, which was still the case even at Vatican II. But at Vatican II, we had this cohort of very thoughtful, well-formed men and they were men who came out of the global south and were able to and because the structure was you gathered in your own conference groups, they were able to really begin that conversation that then produced Medellin and Puebla, which impacts us to this day. I mean, I know we pulled the Roman Church pulled back from liberation theology to some degree, but I think Pope Leo is going to pull the Catholic consciousness more toward it. And it also takes me, this is being a little long-winded here, but it also takes me to something that is a point of view that you and Father Jayme and I share, which is that we feel very strongly that our American legacy as people formed in the Roman Catholic system is an important part of the character of our movement in the United States. We have people in the movement who really want to kind of cut us off at the 4th century and really align with the old Catholics of Europe and kind of think about the earliest church. And yet for me, thinking about the legacy from really Vatican I on is critical to our times. When you described that oppressive theology of bear your cross in this world and your reward will be great in the next. Well, that was the message that my forebears in Ireland got. That was the message that was given to everybody as they were crucified by the Industrial Revolution and people fled into the cities. It wasn't until Rerum Novarum and the idea that workers had rights and that people had dignity, that was even in the consciousness. This is a fairly recent development in Catholic Christianity. And I'm not so quick to, as you know, from many conversations we've had, and Jayme and I've had similar conversations, I'm not so quick to eject that part of our Roman Catholic heritage. So I'd love to hear your take on being independent Catholic and yet at the same time, retaining this deep love and appreciation for our family of origin and not being too quick to release that heritage.
Right. I'm so thankful for the shoulders of people that we stand on, and it seems like every generation adds to, calls us forth, passes on the tradition. And so for me, it's hard to just like take a 100-year section of Catholic and Christian, if you will, theological development, and just sort of say we're just going backwards. So for me, it's trying to hold on to all the good that has been given to us, the storehouse of wisdom that's part of our tradition, and so as you know in these conversations, and one of the things I'm very thankful for in our Ecumenical Catholic Communion is we don't see ourselves as anti, you know. anti-Roman, right? It's like we don't see ourselves as anti-Catholic. We see ourselves as truly a part and a prophetic part of the Catholic tradition that's calling us to be more, right? And for a lot of reasons, we find ourselves either walked the gangplank and we're off the boat, but we're still connected to the tradition and we still hold on to that sacred tradition. And so when I think about all that led up to Vatican II and all the wisdom that was part of that, one of the people I think of I met years ago was Mary Luke Tobin, who was one of the women at the council, a sister of Loretto. And just to think that there's been women for years kind of inviting, calling forth, pushing for, and to see in our lifetime women like yourself ordained. Thanks be to God, right? I mean, I think there's so many Roman Catholics are saying like, when, Lord, when, Lord, and to now be able to feel that there is a place and that we're part of the same tradition, right?
Mhm.
Bishop Pablo, I'm intrigued to ask. I studied the Washington Theological Union at the turn of the 21st century, which was considered a very cutting-edge institution in terms of its theology at that time. And when we studied Latin American liberation theology, we just saw these theologians in Central and South America who were really prophetic, but who also suffered as a result of the stances that they were taking. I'm thinking especially on behalf of, for instance, the magisterium. How it was that people like Papa Ratzinger, Pope Benedict XVI, really went after persons like Leonardo Boff. So, here we saw a real concrete way in which they placed themselves among those who were suffering and marginalized and really suffered with them. Any perspective from one who was within that context for those like myself who saw them as very much prophetic voices who were being silenced and
Right.
marginalized. I'd love to hear your perspective on that suffering.
Yeah, yeah. Some things I would say it's like I really believe this, and I think it happened with Romero. It will happen to anybody. Put yourself in the midst of people who are suffering deeply, and your theology will shift. If it hasn't been um, connected, yeah, I just think it grows out of connectedness with those who are suffering. And if you aren't in that, it's hard to grasp it in the same way. I think some of our biases that we have is that, we carry the theologies that work for us and not just maybe, theologically, but politically as well as economically. And to be in places with people who are on the margin and putting oneself to see from their perspective, it just shifts everything. I believe, if you will, Ratzinger, if he would have been there, lived there, I think he would have come away with similar things and if he would have made himself a part of a community of those who are on the margins. It's so key. If you don't do that, you aren't going to see that way, right? And so I think the people who oftentimes find themselves at odds with this, they call it, Marxist influenced in a way that they see as really negative and horribly divisive. And um, there's things about Christianity Christianity that sort of should be prophetic in regards to capitalism, right? It should be. And I think liberation theology is like, hey, how about this, how about that, right? But I think it's a huge threat to this day, right, for people who have a lot to lose economically.
That seems like a really good segue, Pablo, to ask you the question, how do you think, that was such a formative experience for who you were when you were a priest ministering, but you've never cut that tie because you've continued even as you came back to the United States and married and have had a family and whatever, you've continued to be, deeply connected. How is all of that How would you want all of that experience you've had and that, we're having here, even by focusing on in our own little towns about, who's on the margins that we could serve. How should this be informing us as we look at what's going on in the United States today?
Yeah, and maybe my way of starting that is by saying that seeing how the U.S. has been in its what would I say, its friendships with dictators in Latin America, supporting our business interests and empowering their security forces to keep the status quo. The violence that was done to people throughout Latin America, um, it's so when I see what's going on in the United States right now against immigrants, it's like that's it. You go and you just you make yourself as instruments of terror of the powers to be. You try to um, cover your face so no one knows what you're doing. There's no accountability, and you take people from their homes, you take people from the streets, you just take them from their workplaces, and you quote disappear them. Right? It's it's what's going on here is what had gone on there for years, there to the point of murder, torture, and genocidal stuff. Here, you certainly have, you know, um, detention centers that, to me, there's an element of torture that's going on with people when you're separating them from their families, and so my hope for us as Christians, as Catholics, independent Catholics, is we know what it's like to be on the margins, what it's felt like, and in a lot of different ways for how we came into um, this communion, right, into this movement. And so it's really natural for us to be able to say, oh, I'm going to align myself with others who are on the margins as well. I just think of, if you mentioned the Irish, there was a lot of Irish nuns and priests in Latin America. It was so easy for them to connect to the stories of what was happening in Latin America because they saw it happen to their ancestors in Ireland, right? So they were immediate allies, right? So that's my hope, is that we would be allies, right? We'd be able to recognize the themes, recognize the patterns, and say like it's happening again. It's happening again, and it's in our midst. And so I think if we read the gospel really close and we put ourselves close in relationship with people who are experiencing this, it will inform us how to be, right. Um,
Right. I think that one of my observations is that the Euro-American community in the United States is suffering from a very dangerous form of amnesia, particularly the Roman Catholic community, which overwhelmingly voted for the current administration that's in office in DC right now. That one of the costs of assimilation and becoming part of the dominant culture is you have to get rid of your prior cultural roots. So you have to get rid of your language, you have to get rid of your cultural practices, all of that, and assimilate into this, dominant culture. And what it costs you is the sense of the suffering of your people that brought you here in the first place. There are a lot of people who are rooted in ethnic traditions that came to this country because of persecutions, you know, and because of lack of opportunity. And once they were here, their people were gravely discriminated against. Our group, one of our groups from our Caris community, got together to watch the movie Cabrini recently. And, that's such a vivid story of what Italians faced coming to this country. So I think that amnesia is part of what we have to undo in this country, so that people understand that person is me, and that person is Christ, that we are, grabbing off the street. I'm also, pretty gravely concerned about the bombings that are going on the coast of Venezuela and Colombia. That we're doing basically what these regimes did, just blowing people out of the water, obliterating them, not even knowing who they are, you know.
Yeah, very very alarming what's taking place and seemingly without accountability whatsoever. Again, a pattern. It's a pattern. It seems like we as a country, with our ideology, and using that to militarize, ourselves in the protection of our way of life, if you will. Yeah, it's very very disturbing.
I think what concerns me as well is as we look at this, it's almost as if there is a war against Spanish-speaking persons or against our neighbors to the south. That is to say, since Donald J. Trump came down that golden escalator in July of 2015 and labeled Mexicans as rapists and criminals, we've seen this trend toward um, creating this in-group, out-group theology of fear. I'm recalling how it was that for weeks we had this narrative of caravans coming from the south and invading the U.S. And now it just seems to be reflected in these in the it's like history keeps repeating itself. It's just a new verse, if you will. And the newest verse is the militarization of various forces against immigrants here in these United States internally and externally. Now these now I believe we're up to 80 some bombings now off the coast of Venezuela, and talk this morning in the news of having boots on the ground, the possibility of having boots on the ground in Mexico. There's just something that is very alarming to me as a Catholic priest looking at this is, whereas Jesus of Nazareth and Paul of Tarsus had this vision of, of all of us being part of the body of Christ, there is this
Mhm.
othering going on with
Yeah.
respect to Spanish-speaking persons in our nation and south of our border that just really, really troubles me, Bishop Pablo. I'm wondering
Mhm.
how you think through this as a bishop and as one with a deep love in your heart for people of Spanish-speaking nations.
Right. When I think of liberation theology and its, two of its tenets is one is denouncing. There's a denouncement of that which is not of God, right? Not of life. And it's announcing what is of life and what is of God. What does God wish, right? And I think you put your finger on that um, thing that we do as human beings to make us and them, and then we divide, and then we could conquer, and we dehumanize, and we do horrible things because it's them. And one of the things that I found in studying Latin America, some people who don't have a real deep understanding of liberation theology might just think it's all political, right? It's all just economic, and really beautiful, at least liberation theologians that I um, resonate with. They speak of a deep uh, inner level, like be it one's transformation of liberation of our own personal selves, right? And and a call to contemplation, which will lead us to a sense of oneness and a sense of connectedness to God and others, where even those who are doing these things, horrible things, we have to not see them as them. It's like, oh, wait, that's my knee jerk. It's them doing it to us, right? Or the people I care about. But to say it's like we're doing this to each other. And so, how do I even pray for the wholeness of and the healing of our system structures and our world community, right? I think deep behind it, that it's a healing is needed, and bombing and killing does not bring about healing. It only makes the wound greater, right? So, my hope is again that we're able to see things for what they are and call ourselves into accountability, and then to strongly see what we're called to be, right? And be able to say we're about each other. Yeah. There's
So,
some things in
Bishop,
there I'm saying I need conversion myself because there's a part of me that was it's like when you want to point a figure at something that's wrong, and there's a danger of making them to be less than who God sees everyone to be, which is we always say it's like the beloved of God. You mean they're all the beloved of God?
Yeah.
Everyone's the beloved of God. And if everyone's the beloved of God, what are we doing? What are we doing to each other?
So, Bishop Pablo, I have to ask, because when we speak of the evil things that we as human beings do when we other people, and hearing you speak about prayers for healing and wholeness, I noticed that you have a very beautiful backdrop behind you, and I'm wondering if you might be able to tell our listeners what it is that we're seeing and the significance of why it is that you would choose an image like that for this conversation today.
Sure. Many years ago, when I first visited the cathedral in El Salvador, Oscar Romero's tomb was in the upper part of the cathedral and covered with, flowers, and there's plaques of attested healings. He was seen for years and years as, the saint that worked miracles and brought about transformation. Um, when he was trying to find allies for himself, he really looked to the Vatican, and Paul VI was sympathetic to what was happening, and he presented things that was happening. And unfortunately, where John Paul II came from was, was a man of his times. He was coming out of communist Poland, and he was pushing against this whole um, world that was oppressing them, and he's so associated, and the way he saw liberation theology, unfortunately, was really seeing it through a Marxist lens, right, and that a class warfare, and so he didn't see it correctly the way at least a lot of liberation theologians in Latin America were seeing things. And he listened very much to the bishops on the right wing who were part of the Episcopal bishops in El Salvador. And so, anyways, when he came there years later after Romero's death, he was coming through the city, and they had, different places where he was going to go visit. He was going to go to one place and another place, um, but they were going to avoid the cathedral and certainly avoid Romero's tomb. And when they were passing at the cathedral, he said, "Stop." And they said, "No, no, this is not on our tour going through the city. We're going to other places." He said, "Stop." Right? He went to he went to the tomb. He knelt down and he prayed. And I guess that speaks to me of recognizing that we can make mistakes even in whatever positions we are in, and we could be misled by others who seemingly are telling us what is truth, and then we find out that the truth is different, right? And so I'm thankful that at least a lot of people saw this as a moment in time where maybe um, part of the church was being reconciled with another part of the church.
And for those of you who are listening and aren't seeing the image behind Pablo, I'd like to just take a moment to describe it to you. So the beautiful place of interment of the body of Oscar Romero, surrounded by flowers and ferns, and at in the foreground is a rear view of the Bishop of Rome, John Paul II, kneeling in prayer. It's a very, very moving image. So, as we think about our little peanut movement, we have all these small churches in the ECC, and we have many, many communities all over our movement. What is our place in this? What are we called to do, Pablo, as you look out at our horizon and you think, what is our unique charism as the kind of Catholics that we're trying to be?
I sense that the beauty of us is being bigger and wider and deeper, and as I mentioned beforehand, the invitation to um, connect constantly with those who are on the margins. We've experienced ourselves that way. And how do we not forget that? Just as we don't want to assimilate into like, oh, let's just imagine uh, some church body said, we now recognize you as you can be part of us and in communion us. And if we forgot where we came from, like we came from being excluded, we came from being rejected and uh, being cast aside. So I think there is that natural affinity because of what we've experienced to be always reminded that I need to be on the margins. I need to be connected to people on the margins because that's where Jesus was hanging out. And he was very, very compassionate in his ministry. And so I would pray that we in our movement, our lives are marked by deep compassion, personal transformation, a sense of union with God that we're called to, that will enable us to not only feel connected to other Christians, but other people in the world. I believe we're on the cusp of um, being called into an awakening of oneness amongst all peoples, and in that happening, how we come to pray together or be together, those questions, maybe are are being worked out as we live them in our own experience. But I think that's what we're called to be. I think it's at leaven. We're called to be leaven, and isn't that great?
And, if you look behind me, you can see a picture over here of the Leaven Woman. And that was commissioned for a center that I ran for 5 years out of a large Roman Catholic church here. And she is a South American woman. And she is
Mm,
sitting with the big bowl in her lap with the globe in it, and she is kneading the bread. The primary metaphor in the documents of Vatican II for the role of the laity is to be leaven, be that catalyst wherever you are found. And as I think about, Pope John Paul II behind you, I think too that recovering the word that came out of his culture from the docs, solidarity, that we are called to be in solidarity with one another. And we cannot stay silent. We cannot turn our eyes away from the people who are being crucified on our very own streets. And I say that coming to you from right outside Minneapolis, where we saw George Floyd lynched in front of fellow community members calling out for help, and people disempowered to do anything. So we have to be willing to see, think, act, right? Pray, and be the eyes and and the ears and the hands of God in those situations. It's going to press a lot of us. I
mhm.
also think it's a great opportunity because, again, as we were watching the news coverage from Charlotte last night, they had 1/10 of the entire city population turn out for trainings and action.
Wow.
800 of 10,000 people came out to be
Wow.
trained on what to do in response to what happens if people are grabbed by ICE. Well, wow, 1/10 of the city. And that is
Mm,
a North Carolina city. Now, granted, it's a little bluer than a lot of other spots in North Carolina, but it is still, it's a southern city. Remembering lack of, giving up their amnesia,
right.
remembering maybe the civil rights movement, remembering maybe the Beatitudes, right?
Hmm.
The things that we're called to. So I'm wondering too, is this a moment where we might begin to see people realize that there's a place for the church in a culture that has kind of maybe not, it's not even disdain, it's kind of indifference in some generations, that there's a place for the church and our message and our leadership.
Hmm. Right. And I find my students working with college students, liberation theology is the first time Christianity makes sense to them. It's interesting. They're like, oh, this is what fires me. This is what gets me excited about, the possibility of being connected to Catholicism or Christianity, right? Is somehow something that is not in line with the status quo when you're seeing the suffering of the world, but rather it's about, as you were, accompaniment, as about solidarity, about really working and choosing to be on the side of those who are in need of help, people who would be considered poor, the words of the past, right? Um, One of the things I just have to share with you, because I just don't hear it in the conversations like from an intellectual perspective, if we would study our history and understand how the United States, as a young, growing empire, got involved in Latin America, and how we, falling on the footsteps of the Spaniards or Portuguese, how we we connected with these countries in business practices that were not fair, that led their countries to be in a position that they were, if you will, underdeveloped in a lot of ways. And so, is it a big surprise? Once you learn that whole story and the history, you're like, well, come on, folks. Why do you think we have any responsibility for people who are flocking to our country because of how we were years in the past with their countries? Most people in the world do not want to leave their country
Mhm.
and leave their family and friends. They don't want to do that. They want to live happily. But if the resources are no longer there, and if in our world economies, we've taken so much of the lion's share, and from them, it's like go to any big cities and ask the question, like, who built these cities, right? Isn't it a weird thought to think about our immigrants that come here and make our houses aren't able to live in the houses? They can't live in a house, most of them, because they can't buy a house. It's too expensive. But I wish we would ask those questions, right? And I really think people of goodwill, if you really study and look at the questions, you'd be like, wow. And as we know, so many of our immigrants are keeping our country afloat. Our farmers, they're moving to places where the young people have decided they don't want to do farming. And farmers are saying, we can't survive without our immigrants. They're the ones that are keeping our farms alive.
Bishop Pablo, I so appreciate the way that you're framing it, only because only recently I've come to call people not poor anymore, but exploited. That is to say, we tend to think of people using this label of poor. We hear in Scripture, the Lord hears the cry of the poor. But when you think about it, these people who live in poverty are in poverty for a reason. When we live in a world with multi-millionaires, now even perhaps our world's first billionaire, it just begs the question of how it is that we can allow people to be exploited and to live in conditions that are just so terrible. Bringing this back to our movement, though, Bishop Pablo and Reverend Trish, I think one thing that strikes me is now that our siblings of the Roman Church have now enjoyed 4 non-Italian popes in a row, the last 2 of which are from South America, if you will. We know that Pope Leo XIV, of course, is an American, but he spent considerable time in Peru. In fact, he was a bishop in Peru from 2015 to 2023. And I know that that experience has greatly shaped the way that he sees the world in much the same way that it shaped the way that Francis saw the world, being, one who, grew up in the context of Argentina. It seems that the Roman Catholic Church has something that we do not in this movement, because this movement, it largely grows well in US soil, but it has grown less well in the soil south of our border. Inclusive Catholicism, independent Catholicism, these non-Vatican expressions of Catholicism. And so I guess one question for us within this movement is how it is that we might better listen to the voices of our siblings south of the US border, and or of those siblings that reside here in the US but who speak other languages, especially those who speak languages that we may not understand ourselves. How do we really cultivate that sense of solidarity and deep human respect for their dignity? How do we better listen to them, I think, is my essential question.
Mm,
How do we as cutting edge Catholics better listen to the voices of the Southern Hemisphere and of Central and South America?
right. Great question. One of the things I'll share with you, there's a program that at the university that my wife and I have been involved with for years called our Spanish English Exchange Program, where my wife recruits families of immigrants to open their homes to our students. And the first hour that it's a mini immersion, first hour of the week when they're there, it's a 2 hour once a week program. So the first hour they're in Spanish, and then the second hour they're tutoring the kids, and it's about a kind of fair exchange. And as they begin to meet people and know people, um, they find that they're they're transformed by the goodness of people and who they are and how they are, and they want to learn the language, right? But I know people that are really moved by this and want to be in solidarity, people of good faith, and they're connecting to organizations that are directly serving um, immigrants right now and at-risk populations. And so by being a part of those and offering the skills that they have as volunteers, that's one of the ways they can. But if there's any ways that one could personally get to know people, learn the language, practice, um, and short of that, being deeply connected with people who are, and churches that are, for us to imagine ourselves as connecting with other church communities, or maybe offering sanctuary to families, right? And how could we be part of that? Back in the 80s, the sanctuary movement was big, right? Early 90s, and that was another way that people could hear their stories, understand where they're coming from, and deeply, deeply um, feel connected. So it's not them, and just even like the poor, it's like, no, this is these are people I know and I like, and in fact I've come to love them. And once you come to know them and love them, then it's us, right? It's us. And my students, when we go to Latin America and we do homestays, and then when you're with people who are just in deep poverty, you're like, you can't help but feel their love and their joy, and feel like, wow, um, how do I see the world different, right? And live in the world differently.
We're kind of coming to the end of our time now. I'm struck, Bishop Pablo, by your observations that we need to know our history. We need to learn and open our hearts. And I teach theology at a Catholic university in my region. And it is pretty amazing to me, as even students, who are coming out of a Christian home, have very little context often for what we're talking about. And many students are nominally Christian, and some have not been raised in any faith tradition. Actually, the students that are most grounded in their faith tradition in my classroom are my Muslim students, who are very well formed in their faith. And so, for those of us, our listeners or viewers, just would encourage you to dip your toe in. It can be a little overwhelming to think, oh my gosh, I don't know if I can read Leonardo Boff or Ella Correa or any of these folks. Well, you know what you could do? You could rent the movie Romero. You could just take a journey for 2 hours with Raul Julia, bringing you into the story of how this person was slowly transformed by opening himself up to the experience of the campesinos and beginning to see his own world as very flawed, and that the people in his pews who professed their faith were actually acting gravely in contrast to it. So sometimes the popular culture just gives us a really good entry point, a good book or whatever. So, if you're listening and you're kind of curious about this, but it sounds a little overwhelming, just find that little baby step into the topic. It's one of the things I do is have my students read Romero's Last Sermon, which is only 2 pages long, and it's out on the internet, and it'll rock your world reading what this man had the courage to say. And the following week, he was assassinated at the altar. So it's a really important topic. It's some very, very moving, empowering theology. So I think that's going to be my final word. I'm wondering if Jayme, you have a final word, and then we can give Bishop Pablo a final word.
Happily. I just want to say how delighted we are, Bishop Pablo, to have you here with us, sharing of your experience in Central America, particularly because for me it brings back some fond memories, both of studying Latin American liberation theology at the Washington Theological Union, but also of my first experience of being in Guatemala and Honduras and El Salvador, and being so profoundly moved and shaken to my core by the poverty of the people there. And as a result, it just really has left me with this sense of compassion for those who come to us here at Holy Family Catholic Church in Austin, Texas, many of whom come from immigrant communities. It weighs on me so heavily The fear, the terror with which they are living these days is real. It is palpable. It's something that I hear every single Sunday as we continue to discuss ideas. In many ways, it's like living through the COVID pandemic again, insofar as we're just living through a time of some unknowns. During COVID, we were trying to figure out what was going on and how to respond to it. And in the same way now, we're trying to figure it out. When we hear of raids at local flea markets, or, as we discuss the fears of the people, and how do we as a church respond to that and be a place where people can feel safe to come and to find refuge. I really have appreciated this conversation for helping bring attention to the plight of other persons. There are various principles of Catholic social teaching, solidarity, human dignity that we just cannot take our eyes off of or lose focus of. We need to continue to speak out and to see the presence of Christ in our siblings, in our sisters and brothers, especially those who are living in such fear now. But also we need to be prophetic, even if that means that it will cost us, even if it means that we will be crucified. We need to stand up and call out those forces that are an affront to human life and to human dignity. So, Bishop Pablo, thank you for helping to open our eyes a bit to realities south of our border and within our borders that are just really, really troubling right now. Bishop Pablo, we'll give you the last word. What a delight to have you with us.
Thank you so much for inviting me to be with you all. I'm always energized by speaking about um, the themes that we're talking about today. I just probably to piggyback on what Trish said, there's a book that I usually have our students read. Simple introductory guide, just called Liberation Theology by Robert McAfee Brown. That might be a good starting place to if you want to really get a sense of what this is and how to maybe the ways that maybe you've learned about it, but maybe in a more systemic way to understand, a systematic way to understand it. So thank you so much. Blessings on you and your bringing the gospel to people in the many ways that you do, both of you, uh, Reverend Dr. Jayme and Trish Vani, Reverend Dr. Trish Vani. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Bishop Pablo Burson of the Ecumenical Catholic Communion. We so greatly appreciate you and your ministry and your presence with us today. We also want to thank all of our listeners here at Cutting Edge Catholics Podcast, a podcast of renewal, reconstruction, and resistance. I'm Father Jayme Matthias.
And I am Reverend Trish Sullivan Vani.
Thank you all for joining us. We'll see you the next time.
Thank you for joining us for Cutting Edge Catholics, a podcast of renewal, reconstruction, and resistance. For more information on inclusive Catholicism, please visit extraordinarycatholics.faith. Keep the faith.